Well, welcome everybody. We're really excited to have Ed speaking about civics and what we can do and why we need to teach it. Ed is the lead of the Restore Our Democracy. We call it ROD, R-O-D. It is one of our 10 issue teams. NWSOFA stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We are an indivisible chapter. We are one of 6,500 indivisible chapters across the country. The Northwest Suburbs is kind of referred to as the land beyond O'Hare, although now a full 15% of our membership, which is over 5,200 members, resides in Chicago, and about 7% in other states across the country. That's the benefit of Zoom. We cover 6 suburbs here, 6 townships, with 650,000 folks. And as you can see, our 10 issue groups are healthcare, immigration, social justice, women's rights, our fiscal and economic group, our electoral process and our work on elections, climate change, which we have tomorrow night, and then our Restore Our Democracy group, and then our very first group, gun violence prevention, and then Conversation Z, which is for the younger folks. So we cover all these areas in the blue as our leads. And then on the left-hand side, we have our communications group. And we're always looking for folks to help us with YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these different areas. Next slide, please. So to help us manage all this, we have 26 volunteers, non-paid, that put a lot of time into these issue teams. Most of the issue teams have 2 leads. And then 5 of these folks, as Christine is helping us tonight, work on the communication side. So we're really pleased to have Ed Spire here. He does talks all across the country, particularly in the Chicagoland area and the burbs. Ed, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Bill referred to me as the lead of the Restore Our Democracy project. I will say I am the co-lead. My partner, Jim McGrath, does a lot of work in more local areas. I do a little more work in state and federal areas. But tonight's topic really relates to local action. I think that Jim is just as involved as I am in this work. So let me start the presentation now. We're going to talk about teaching civics, and I'm an engineer, so I believe that we need to measure things to understand them. I mean, just measure them numerically. So we'll talk about some measurements of how we're doing. I think we're not doing very well, so we're going to talk about why. What are the causes of the difficulties we've had in teaching civics and what we can do about it. And of course, every presentation has to end with a call to action, because it's your action that can help us move forward. Our students' understanding of our country's history, the way we got where we are, and how our civic life works is not doing well. There's a group that runs a national assessment of educational progress. It's referred to as a Nation's Report Card. It's showing these days that fewer than 1 in 4 students are really proficient in these areas. Only 13% of 8th graders were proficient in history. 22% were proficient in civics, which is kind of interesting. It means there's a little more awareness of now than then, but still, neither of those numbers are high enough. And it's gone downhill in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, it was 15 and 24%. Now it's 13 and 22%. We're not going in the right direction in this area. But actually, that doesn't tell the whole story. It's not just about their loss of knowledge. It's about their connection to our country. Here's a couple of knowledgeable folks who have some things to say. Too many of our students are struggling. They're struggling to understand and explain the importance of civic participation, how our government works, the historical significance of events. If our students don't understand how our government works and how they're supposed to participate, then they don't or can't participate. Here's a 12th grade government teacher in South Carolina. These are the 2 critically important subject areas, not just for the success of our students individually, but for the success of us collectively as a society. We can't succeed as a democracy, as a republic, if our people don't understand what it takes to participate in those activities. And this is not just due to the pandemic. I mean, there's been a drop due to the pandemic, but there was dropping before that too. Again, let me quote some knowledgeable folks. There's been a profound impact of the pandemic because there's still over and above that, there are politicians who cut educational funding, politicians who limit learning. And these folks are doing this out of partisan motivations, banning books, censoring educators from teaching about the problems we've had in the past. I mean, one of the folks just talking to me talked about the sins of the past. And I don't really want to talk about these things as sins, but if there are problems in our past, we do need to recognize that and make sure we correct them. It's a disservice to ignore those things. Censoring those kinds of teachings from our subjects does a disservice to our students. It does not help us move in the right direction. This fellow at Harvard who says, while the data doesn't really point directly to a reason for our decline recently, it's fair to speculate that the ongoing debates over how to teach history, how to teach civics, may well be getting in the way of actually doing it. And I firmly believe that that's part of the problem we have right now. And this degradation shows up across generations. If you look at understanding of civics and history by generation, you'll find that 3/4 of the folks in my generation are pretty proud of the way we do things around here. But then it drops off. 54% for Gen X, 36% millennials, 16% of Gen Z members. Now, when I look at the data, I think that some of it comes from our experience in life. The older we get, the more we're involved, the more we see how things work, the more we might understand or have concerns. So some of that might just come from experience, but some of it probably comes from education as well. And the important point is this: we can't have a democracy in our country unless people want one. And right now, the younger you get, the more confidence you have in our democracy, the more certain you are that the system we have is a good one. And that's a problem, because the system we have really is a pretty good one. It's not the best one, but it's a pretty good one. And we need to help people understand that it's a pretty good one and how we can make it better. So there's some further evidence that it's not just a pandemic. I mean, we've been going backwards on this since 2014. 2018, we're down 4 points on understanding of our graduating students on history. And a lot of students were taking an 8th grade class in history, but that's come down from 72 to 68. And once again, national educators who look at this stuff, even this is even conservative fellow, will help point out what's going on. We have state standards that aren't as good as they should be. Our teachers aren't as trained as well as they should be. We don't put enough time into this. The curriculum is not well defined, and there's no accountability. And that all boils down to kind of a Sputnik moment, kind of a realization. This is a problem for our nation. We're not preparing our students to be participants in American democracy. And this has got to be a call to action. We see more and more polarization. We see more and more doubts about our form of government, about the truth. And we need to counter that stuff. And we need to do it in our schools. So why is this happening? Well, it's been 3 decades that we've seen these declines. Every time we do this study, we come out, the results come out, we see that things are a little worse than they were last time. For 30 years, things have gotten a little worse every year. And we always say, we got to do something about this, but we don't do anything about this. And it's not just underinvestment. The real problem here is that we can't agree on what to teach. The real problem here is that folks on the right, folks on the left have been fighting in front of school boards, fighting in front of the legislatures, fighting in front of teachers as to what we should teach. And because we can't agree on what to teach, we're not teaching much of anything. We've seen the problems in front of our school boards. I mean, this is one of the reasons I'm so proud of what Jim has been doing in terms of defending our school boards. But that's, as far as I can tell, that's the source of the problem here. The more polarized we get, the more further apart we get in our nation, the more and more we just can't agree on what to teach. And then we don't teach much of anything. Here's some examples of the kind of things that we can't agree upon. Are we a democracy or a republic? You know, I do a lot of social media debates because it helps me fine-tune my understanding. I learn. And I often see people say, no, we're not a democracy or a republic. And I try and discuss that. But it really is two different viewpoints. People who talk about we're a democracy, they care about universal inclusion. They care about participation, popular sovereignty. Then there are people who think about us as a republic, a union of states, and they care about the structure of our republic, the order involved in that, the constitutionalism and the rule of law. Those are really two kind of different ways of looking at what our government is. Look at, do you value patriotism or do you value solidarity? Are we loyal to our nation or are we loyal to each other? Some folks on the right think loyal to the nation is the most important thing. Folks on the left think supporting one another is the most important thing. Another way of thinking about this is, are we looking at the past and the future? I mean, we have some people who claim that the founders' design is perfect, should never change. And we have other people who point to the problems we have now and that we can't fix them without changes to the design the founders created. So those are the kinds of disagreements. Those are the kinds of conflicts where one on one side and one on the other can't really agree or don't. They push our educational system one way or another. And then when you push your education system this way and other people push it that way, it ends up going nowhere. So we need to find common ground. We need to build a curriculum that guides the middle path, that can avoid the extremes on either the left or the right, and help our students understand how our country is supposed to work, how we want our country to work. And there's a group called Educating for American Democracy Educating for American Democracy. They've put together a roadmap. These are professional educators from both sides of the aisle who've put together a roadmap. This has been funded by the federal government, and it's a roadmap designed to teach history and civics all the way down to kindergarten. Now, some people might say, all the way down to kindergarten? Well, I mean, at the lower grade levels, you still want to teach some things that build the foundation. You want to teach some things so that children think about the concepts involved. They think about place. They think about origins. They think about groups. They think about countries. They think about boundaries. They think about the basic concepts that somebody's got to understand to build on, to build on an understanding of government and how people are involved in government. It's a curriculum that goes all the way through grade school and high school. And it's been funded by both left administrations, the left and the right. Former education secretaries from each party have supported it, and it's being implemented in a few states, in 9 states, both conservative states and liberal states. And they're looking for more states to get involved in implementing this curriculum. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this curriculum to help you see how this, I believe, is a way we can move forward in teaching our children about what American democracy and how they can participate, how they should participate is important. And this was created basically from what they term a moral revolution, a revolution where they determined, people from the educators from both sides of the aisle determined that they were going to work hard to compromise, to find a way forward despite the kinds of conflicts I showed you a couple of slides back. Instead of fighting one another, they'll find some common ground. For example, when you talk about, are we a democracy or a republic, these folks compromised by recognizing that they're trying to educate folks for a constitutional democracy where both order and structured rule of law are important, but so are popular sovereignty and universal exclusion. All those principles matter to the kind of constitutional democracy that we want to have here in this country. When they talk about patriotism versus solidarity, they talked that through and they agreed that the way we want to do this is we want to cultivate what they term as reflective patriotism, a conviction that honesty will sustain, nourish, and lift up a commitment to the common good and to one another. A common good for the nation is a common good for all the people of the nation. So you can find a way to say that patriotism and solidarity are basically the same thing when you view it as we're going to help our nation by helping one another. These folks worked very hard to find a common ground between the left and the right to build a curriculum that supports the things that we see are important in our nation. So this is a curriculum which is built on questions. The educators believe, and I think they're right, well, I know they're right, that a population that really supports democracy has to think about what it means, has to think about what we need to do to implement a democratic government. So, and that means you don't really just tell students stuff. You ask them stuff. You get them to think about it. You ask them, what does this or that or the other mean? What does this mean to you? What does this mean to them? And you teach them to think about the issues of civics. You teach them to think about what strengthens our fundamental democratic capacity. And this entire roadmap that I'm showing you tonight is structured around questions, putting inquiry at the center of learning, which is the Socratic method. It's build a vehicle that would support kind of an open-ended, inquiry-based teaching. That's what pedagogy means, teaching. I struggled with that myself first time I saw that word, where the answers are not obvious in advance, but you all talk it through. Y'all come to the answers in the classroom. It's not just the teacher giving you this. It's y'all working through it together. Here's some example of questions. So at a higher grade, when people have been thinking about history, you'll talk to them about the changes in our nation through the 1600s and the 1700s. How was liberty there or not there at these various stages of our country? And how did those things change over time? So there certainly civics and history have a relationship. You have to teach how we got here. You have to teach what happened in our country and how we have worked over time to create a more perfect union. You have to teach students to evaluate when these changes are significant or not. Is it a minor change or do we make a significant change? How do the laws we have and our social structures change? They've certainly changed over the decades, or over the centuries. How can the Constitution be changed? We need to teach our students that the Constitution is not fixed. It's not the founders gave us this and that's all there is to it. We've modified the Constitution many times. In fact, after the Civil War, we made major changes to our Constitution to bring more popular support. I mean, before the Civil War, state legislatures elected senators. They weren't elected popular. We made a lot of changes in retrospect of the experience we had in the Civil War. The 14th Amendment made a lot of changes to how our country's structured. So we need to help students think about those issues, how we are in charge. We are in charge of our Constitution, and why have we changed it in the past? And if we want to change the future, we can. People need to understand that. and they need to go back to look at our history and review the political ideas, the economic ideas that have helped us change, helped us grow our country over time. I mean, part of civics education has got to be the history of how we got here and why we're where we were originally and where we are now and how we got from here to there. And that helps people see that if we want to make further changes, we can. We're not stuck with what the founders gave us. We've already moved from what the founders gave us. And if we as a society think we need to go further, we have to understand that we can and how we could do it. So this roadmap that they worked up, this roadmap has a group of themes like civic presentation, how our landscape has changed, who we are as a people, how our government works, how our Constitution works, how transformation has occurred and can occur in the future, how we are a part of the world's community, and how we can have continued discussion, how we can have debates, how we can envision future change, if that's to our benefit. And those are 7 themes we have, and teaching that kind of content is a bit challenging. So they use different methods. We use motivation. We use 5 different methods. This roadmap talks about 5 different methods of teaching those areas about how we can be active, how we can be a plural, a society of many different people, yet still have a shared story. How we can celebrate, but also critique compromise. I mean, compromise is something we need to do, but we need to be careful about it and make sure it's useful compromise. We need to be honest about our understanding of our nation and reflect upon what patriotism really means. I mean, if there are, as was mentioned earlier, if there are sins of our past, such as slavery, we need to confront them honestly and not shy away from them so that we can understand from the evolution of our country and understand what true patriotism means. And we need to balance both the concrete and the abstract, which is an important point. I mean, in the abstract, you might think this principle means thus, and some principle which means thus might in the long run turn out not so good for us. So you need to think about principles, but you also need to think about how those principles would really impact our nation. And are those principles really useful for us or not? So just holding on to a principle, this no matter what, isn't necessarily good. But having no principles isn't good either. So you have to balance those 2 things. So those are 2 ways that this curriculum gets at this. Just to go through them in particular, motivating agency, how students can understand the context of their role as civic participants, how they can become engaged citizens, how they can pursue civic action. We have a plural yet shared story. How can we integrate the perspectives of different kinds of Americans? And how do we do that consistently across our period, our history? And how can that make a more complete story of our nation instead of just thinking about one group that somebody says are the real Americans? Because we're all Americans. We need to both celebrate and critique compromise. We got to teach the value of compromise. We also have to teach the danger, because compromise that destroys freedoms, compromise that destroys the principles on which we depend, are not useful. And we have to help them understand the paradox where we always disagree about the ideal shape of our government, but we continue to agree to preserve shared institutions. So that's something we need to help our students learn about. We have to help them understand what it means to be a patriot, what it means to be honest in our patriocy, how we can account for our constitutional democracy that's honest about the wrongs of the past without being cynical about it, without saying we condemn the past, just saying we learn from the past. And while we appreciate the founders, we don't need to think of them as saints. We need to think of the founders as giving us a foundation that we can build upon in an honest manner. And as I said, we have to not just think about principle as solid. We have to look at principles and we have to think about how they affect our nation. So we have concrete principles. We have a narrative about what's good for our nation. We have a chronology of learning about through our history, and we have to find a way to help folks understand that there's a balance between the concepts of the theories of our nation versus the impact they actually have on our everyday lives. And in the curriculum we're talking about here, they use different techniques for different themes. And you can see kind of how the maturity goes. When you're talking about civic participation, you're going to talk about how we can help people have an effect. When you're talking about changing landscapes, or who are our people, then that gets down to how we are a nation of many different peoples with a shared history. We use the celebrating and critique and compromise to talk about how our government is founded, how our government is constructed, what our Constitution is, and what it should be. We look at our desire to be honest and reflective when we talk about how we have changed our nation over time and how we have transformed ourselves into a more perfect union. And we look at the method of balancing concrete and the abstract to talk about how our place in the world is and what we can do going forward in our nation. This is a very well-built curriculum that discusses important things and uses proper techniques to address them all. And this is all built on inquiry. It's a Socratic method. Within each of the themes, content is broken down into history and civics driving questions. The questions break down the content to help students with deeper understanding. And within each of those sets, the questions are further broken down into guiding questions that provide a glimpse into the type of inquiries. For example, in a lower grade, when you want to talk about how our nation's landscape, our population changes, a lower grade question might be, how do you name your community and talk about your place? And that helps children talk about their own story. Where do I come from? What is my community like? And that helps children understand that there are different communities and that we need to at least recognize the different communities in our nation. In a higher grade, 6th to 8th, you might be talking about how do borders change over time and why do they change over time? And that can be driven down into more content-heavy areas that allow students to explore how the U.S. came to have its current borders, the history of our territorial expansion, the effects of that expansion on various populations. So first, we're talking about what populations are. Now we're talking about how our history affected populations. And when you think about what we've done right, what we've done wrong in the past, this is a way to bring students into seeing the truth about those things, understanding the underlying principles, understanding where we are, how we got here. And we can build on that to talk about letting students decide for themselves what we need to do next. And that's important. We're not here to tell students what to do. We're here to help students think so that they can decide what they think we should do. And now this roadmap is not really a curriculum. It's an advisory document. It supports multiple kinds of curriculums. It can be applied in almost any state. Almost any state's guidelines could work with this roadmap. But it does break new ground by presenting an integrated framework of who we are, how we got here, how to teach history and civics. It inspires and informs the authors of our educational material, our state standards, our curricula, our textbooks are the materials, as well as teachers themselves to rethink, reprioritize civics and American history education. This is a framework, a bipartisan framework that can help our schools reinvigorate civics education. And it can be used within most any state's current standards. It's just an advisory document that helps teachers understand ways throughout grade school and high school that we can help students understand the challenges of living in this very complex democracy that we have, this constitutional democracy that many people call a republic, which it is. And the themes are centered around and designed challenges and thematic questions. They're created to help many different state standards. And the research teams that were involved in this looked at different state standards and found a really good alignment between the state standards in most states and this roadmap. Even though many states are diverse in terms of what they want to teach or not teach, this bipartisan roadmap seems to work well with how most states, both on the left and the right, think about teaching civics. And that makes it kind of different from a lot of state standards because it's focused on inquiry. It's focused on presenting content in the form of questions that should be explored that help our students think about these things. So how can we help move this kind of curriculum forward, this kind of roadmap forward? Adults apparently don't get involved in this stuff. Principals and other officials find that adults hardly ever ask them about these issues. They don't receive a lot of pressure or support to teach this stuff, but they're getting constant pressure to raise test scores, to raise graduation rates, to prepare students for jobs. I mean, that's all important. Yeah, our students should be prepared for jobs, but they should also be prepared to be active citizens in our democracy. And insofar as they hear about civics, they mostly receive complaints about material that one person or other doesn't think is appropriate. They rarely receive encouragement to educate students along these lines. We need to fix that. We need to hold our schools accountable that they teach civics and history. And I believe this roadmap would be a useful manner. We need to encourage our educators to pick up a roadmap like this and use it to improve our civics education. We need clear, positive, constructive, sustained voices with our educational organizations to move forward in this. And local leaders are the people who need to do this. The folks that, we've had a lot of people that have gone to school boards recently to defend against book banning. Well, those same connections that we've made to defend against book banning can now be used to promote better civics education. So what are we going to do? Well, talk to members of the community, those who have influence over education, to help them understand we need to strengthen history and civics education. It's a way to improve our democracy and a way to address specific problems in our public life, such as our extreme partisanship and false information that we see. We've been neglecting this area of education. We have deep disagreement in society, but we can build a consensus about the core topics and issues to study in history and civics. And that includes agreement about the deep and worthy disagreements that young Americans need to understand and learn to navigate. These children, they see us fighting one another. They need to understand why it's happening and how they can help us get past that stuff. They all deserve an excellent education in physics and history and a curriculum that connects to their own backgrounds, to their own experiences. And that's exactly what you get when you start to ask students to talk about their own experiences and to think about these things themselves instead of just being taught some principles. Teach them to think. That's what this roadmap proposes. We should be asking these things. Have you looked at how we teach civics? Do you have a plan for strengthening how we teach civics? Do you have a curriculum aligned? Are your teachers looking for and following teaching practices Are they prepared to support these disciplines? What are your youth? And think about the kind of education they're getting, if they're getting any. And how can we, adults who are not in the school system, how can we help? So this brings me to my call for action. My call for action is, first of all, to start talking to these things about in your schools. And, you know, when I talk about this to some folks, they say, well, I don't have kids in school. You know what? I don't care whether they have kids in school or not. Your taxes are paying for the school. You have the right to talk to the school about what they're teaching, whether you have a kid in school or not, because your taxes are paying for the school. So talk to the school. I think we ought to get the school staff, the principal and the civic and the folks in the school involved in this area on board first, and then we should go to the school boards. Then we should go to the school boards and say, this is an area we care about. This is an area we need to do better on. This is an area where we have some suggestions. Here's a suggestion. Here's this roadmap. This roadmap works very well, and we want you to adopt it. There's a possibility of doing some legislation as well. I just recently talked to an ex-House rep who had put together a bill to require some of these kind of things be taught in the schools in Illinois. And maybe we'll get to where that would be useful. But I personally think we should start with the local schools and school boards. And I also think that legislation that tries to legislate what should be in curriculum is not really a good idea. I think legislation needs to be more general than that. We need to let educational professionals decide what should be in the curriculum. And now we need to make progress on this, and I'm here to help. I'll be happy to give this presentation to any group that wants to see it. I'll be happy to come to school board meetings with folks. I'll be happy to provide this material, and that's my call to action. So I'm done, and well, I guess there is a broader call to action. We need to move beyond our extreme polarization. Why would our children and students want to get involved in democracy when they see us fighting about it? We've got to quit fighting about our politics and set a good example for our children that we can compromise. We've got to find common ground. It's hard to win if we try to connect our kids to a broken political system. So yeah, we can try and get our schools to teach better, but we also have to fix our political system. We got to fix our democracy. That's an even broader call to action, of course. But the most important thing right now for me is to get to your school, get to your schools, get to your school boards, talk about these things with them. So if you want to talk about fixing our government, I mean, there's all kinds of things we can talk about: enlarging the House, moving to ranked choice voting, multi-member House districts. It's a bunch of things we could talk about to fix our government. But that's really a very big process. It's more than we want to talk about today. But don't think that this is just an issue we have to fix in our schools. It's an issue we have to fix in our country. We need to empower our voters. We need to get social media under control. We need to build a culture of shared commitment in our nation. I'm going through this quickly. I'm going to send all these slides out. We need to make our government responses. We need to make our communities connected. That's a whole lot to do. But you just choose one of those areas and pursue it, and that'll help. And again, I'll help with anything you want to do. So that's it. I'm done. I'm going to send this out. There's reference material here, and I'm ready for questions.